Welcome back, YouTubers. Steve Jobs once said, "The most powerful person in the world is the storyteller." In this installment, we're going to explore why a project manager needs to be a storyteller. We will look at the 4 types of stories that all good leaders tell, the top 5 storytelling tips that every project manager should know, how to turn a story into a legend, and finally, we'll look at why storytelling could be the most important thing you can do as a project manager. So if you don't already know the answers to all these questions, I recommend you stick around for Dr. Greg's Guide to Turning Your Project into a Ripping Yarn. Here's the simple truth. Everything you know, you've learned through experiences. Sometimes these experiences were your own, and sometimes they were others. And how do we learn from someone else's experiences? By listening to their stories. Their funny stories, their sad stories. Their stories of triumphs and failures. Human beings love telling their stories, and we love hearing other people's stories. There's something mystical about a good story. It connects us on an emotional level. A ripping yarn can cause you to suspend your rational thinking and just enjoy the story for what it is. It's been said that stories are the fundamental way in which people understand their world. In fact, stories are so intrinsic in our makeup that some philosophers have even argued that self-awareness is simply the ability to see how your story fits into the greater story of history. Stories can entertain and teach us. They delight and extol us. They can even frighten and inspire us. A good story reaches across the boundaries of culture, education and age. This is why storytelling has been described as one of the most basic tools of leadership. Stories are important because they help us make sense of life. They put information into coherent patterns that we can easily recall. They can take ancient lessons and make them contemporary, or they can help us project what we already know off into an otherwise unknowable future. They also allow us to transfer tacit knowledge. When you tell a story, you can provide the nuances and details that simply can't be related in routines and rules. And while rules, routines and regulations might be a great way for standardising processes and optimising efficiency, they do nothing to encourage dreams, innovation and creativity. This is why storytelling is such a critical competency for project managers. Yes, you can monitor and control a project using rules and routines, but the simple fact is, these won't help you lead a project, and projects need to be led. So if you want to lead your project, you're going to have to learn to tell stories. Each project will have its own story. But interestingly, there's research that indicates that leaders really only ever tell 4 types of stories. Everything you want people to know about your project can be told through one of them. The first type of story is one that helps people understand the project's history. In this story, you select particular events that you want to highlight and you link them together in chronological order so everyone can follow the progression of certain decisions. These stories create what is called a temporal coherence. The second type of story is used by leaders to create cultural coherence. In these stories, the leader cherry-picks certain events and highlights how these underpin the group's culture. The leader then uses this to illustrate how that culture has helped or will help the group through difficult times. The third type of story creates thematic coherence. The whole point of this type of story is to highlight a unifying or recurrent event. As a leader, you can use this type of story to help your team make sense of events by showing them some common thread that connects the dots. The fourth and final type of story is one that links cause and effect. You use this story when you are trying to demonstrate causal coherence. This type of story illustrates how certain events in the past have created our current present. You can even use this story to illustrate possible futures by showing how the actions and decisions today will create or reduce options in the future. As a project manager, all of these story types are available to you. And what you need to remember is that it's the storyteller who gets to make the rules. If you are the storyteller, you decide what events you want to highlight. You get to decide what aspects of the team's culture you want people to notice. You get to choose a theme you want people to see. And you get to decide which parts of the past and what aspects of the future you want people to focus on. That's what Steve Jobs was talking about. If you are the one telling the story, you get to decide what the story is about. and telling the right story about your project is critical. It helps your sponsors and your stakeholders in your team understand what's happening, why it's happening, and why it's important. If you're the storyteller, you're the one who makes sense of what's happening, so you get to decide if you need to teach, encourage, or correct by deciding how you present your story. But even more important than all of this is the realization that every project has a story. And if you're not the storyteller, then someone else is. And then it's their story that everybody's listening to. Now, making sure that you're the one who makes sense of what's being told is important, but it's not the only reason you need to become a project storyteller. The other reason, and perhaps the more important one, is that telling your project story is critical to building your project team. Since the dawn of time, stories or oral history have been central to the idea of belonging. All cultures, society and nations, even sporting teams, have their own stories, and knowing these stories is the passport to be considered part of the group. Our stories are important because hidden within them are the basic principles of how members of this group live, think and behave. A group's stories are their living memories and the foundations for their culture. When members exchange stories with one another, they no longer feel like they're alone. They've become part of a collective. If someone can retell a particular group's story, then it's no longer that group's story. It's now my story. This is why storytelling is such an important skill for project managers. If you're the storyteller, you're both a sense maker and a team builder. Now, as I said, there's as many different stories as there are projects. I can't tell you what story to tell your team, because every project has its own. But despite this, there are some common principles that you should always apply. And here's my top 5 tips for telling project stories. Number 1, make sure the story has a clear message. Don't ramble or send mixed messages. Number 2, make sure the story is relevant to the situation you're in. 3, don't tell stories that are self-serving or boastful. 4, stay away from stories that are sarcastic about the team members. And number 5, where possible, include some self-deprecating humour. Being able to see the funny side of your own failures creates trust with the listener. Storytelling is a reciprocal process. Both the storyteller and the listener need to be actively engaged for it to work. When the story is worth telling and worth hearing, the story comes to life. And when that happens, not only does the story impart a message, but it creates a special bond between the teller and the listener. If the story is good enough, the listener might tell it to someone else. And when they do, something incredible happens. It now becomes their story. And as that story is told and retold, it moves from being entertainment to being a legend. Long after you've moved on, the story will continue to jump from reteller to listener, reinforcing core messages, connecting people at an emotional level, and most importantly, converting outsiders to insiders. And that's perhaps the most important element about project storytelling. If you do it right, everyone involved with the project becomes a co-author. They all feel like they've got a part to play, whether that's creating the story or telling the story. But most important of all, the project story has now become part of their story, and it's their story that matters. So if you're a project manager, make sure you're a teller of epic tales. Take the story of your project and make it into a ripping yarn that everyone remembers and wants to tell others about. If you can do that, they will love you for it. This has been another presentation from Enso Consulting. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. I'm Dr. Greg. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you again soon.